When I was 16, I stopped talking to my father. Not for a day, not for a week, for almost 20 years. People often ask me why. The truth is simple. I believed he never loved me. Growing up, I always felt invisible at home. My younger brother was cheerful and outgoing. He could make everyone laugh. My father seemed proud of him. They talked about sports, school, and movies. Sometimes I watched them from across the room and wondered why things were different with me. I studied hard. I brought home good grades. I tried my best. But my father never smiled and said, "Good job." He only nodded and said, "Keep working." That was all. When I was sad, he said, "Be strong." When I was nervous, he said, "You'll be fine." When I wanted comfort, he gave advice. It never felt like enough. Then my mother died when I was 15. Our house became quiet after that. Too quiet. The dinner table felt empty. The living room felt cold. My father spent most evenings sitting alone. He rarely talked. Sometimes I wanted to sit beside him, but I never did. I was hurting, and I thought he did not care. One rainy evening, everything finally exploded. I came home late from school. I had just won a writing competition. I was excited. I wanted to share something good. I placed the certificate on the table. "Dad, look," I said. He glanced at it for a second. "That's nice," he replied. Then he went back to reading some papers. That was it. Something broke inside me. "That's all you have to say?" I shouted. He looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "I mean you never care," I yelled. "You never care about anything I do." His face became serious. "Don't talk like that." "Why not?" I cried. "You always care more about my brother. You never even look at me." The room became silent. Rain tapped against the windows. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then years of anger came pouring out. "I wish you were not my father." The words filled the room like thunder. My father's eyes widened. For a second I thought he would yell back, but he didn't. He simply looked at me. A long, painful silence passed between us. Then he said quietly, "If that's what you want." That hurt even more. I ran to my room with tears in my eyes. That night I packed a bag. I did not leave immediately. I stood at my bedroom door and waited. Part of me hoped he would stop me. Part of me hoped he would say, "Please stay." But no one came. So before sunrise, I walked out of the house. I believed I was leaving a man who never loved me. I had no idea how wrong I was. The city looked different in the morning light. Everything felt new. Everything felt possible. As the bus carried me farther from home, I kept looking out the window. I told myself I was free now. I told myself I did not need my father anymore. For a while I believed it. Life moved quickly after that. I finished high school in another city. Then I went to college. Later, I found a job and started building a life of my own. Years passed. I made friends. I fell in love. I got married. From the outside, everything seemed fine. But there was one part of my life that never changed. I never spoke to my father. At first, he tried to contact me. A few weeks after I left home, he called. I stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. A month later, he called again. I ignored it. Then came birthdays. "Happy birthday, hope you have a good day." I never replied. Then holidays. "Merry Christmas, take care." Still no reply. Every message was short, simple, almost awkward. Sometimes I laughed bitterly when I read them. After all these years, that's all he can say? I convinced myself that he was only trying to ease his guilt. Nothing more. One day my aunt visited me. We were having tea when she suddenly asked, "Have you talked to your father recently?" I shook my head. "No." She sighed. He misses you. I looked away. He never missed me when I lived there. My aunt stayed quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "That's not true." I did not want to hear it, so I changed the subject. A few years later, my younger brother got married. I attended the wedding because I wanted to support him. My father was there too. It was the first time I had seen him in years. His hair had become grey. There were deep lines on his face. For a moment, he looked older than I remembered. Much older. When our eyes met, he smiled slightly. I looked away. The entire evening, we barely spoke. When I left, I heard him call my name, just once. I kept walking. For some reason, my chest felt heavy during the drive home. But I ignored that feeling too. Life continued. Work became busier. The years became shorter. 1 year turned into 5. 5 turned into 10. Then nearly 20 years had passed since I left home. One evening, I was preparing dinner when my phone rang. It was my brother. I almost didn't answer. When I picked up, I immediately noticed something strange. He wasn't speaking. I could only hear his breathing. "Hello?" I asked. Finally, he spoke. His voice sounded low and tired. "Dad is in the hospital." The knife slipped from my hand and hit the kitchen floor. For a few seconds, I could not say anything. Then my brother said the words I had never expected to hear. "You should come if you want to see him." My heart suddenly began to pound. I didn't know what to do. After I hung up the phone, I stood alone in my kitchen. The room was quiet. Too quiet. My brother's words kept repeating in my head. "You should come if you want to see him." I sat down at the table and stared at the wall. For 20 years, I had imagined this moment. I thought I would feel angry. I thought I would feel nothing. Instead, I felt afraid. What would I say to him? What if he apologized? What if he didn't? The next morning, I bought a train ticket and went home. The journey felt longer than any trip I had ever taken. Outside the window, towns and fields passed by. Inside my mind, old memories returned one after another. My mother's smile, the small house where we lived, the rainy night when I left, the words I could never take back. "I wish you were not my father." When I finally arrived, my brother was waiting for me outside the hospital. He looked exhausted. Neither of us said much during the walk inside. The hospital smelled of medicine and disinfectant. Everything felt cold and distant. My heart beat faster with every step. When we reached the room, my brother stopped at the door. "He has been asking about you," he said quietly. Then he stepped aside. I pushed the door open. For a moment, I could hardly recognize the man lying in the bed. My father had always seemed strong to me. Even when he was silent, he had felt solid, like a wall. Now he looked small, fragile. His hair was completely white. His face was thin. The machines beside him made soft sounds. I stood frozen near the doorway. Then his eyes slowly opened. He looked toward me. For a second there was confusion in his face, then recognition. His eyes became brighter. A small smile appeared. "You came," he whispered. His voice was weak, almost fragile. I swallowed hard. "Yes," I answered. That was all, just one word. I had imagined giving a speech. I had imagined asking questions. Instead, I stood there like a stranger. My father patted the chair beside his bed. I sat down. The silence between us felt enormous. After a while, he asked, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "How's work?" "Good." He nodded slowly. The conversation felt awkward. Two people who shared a lifetime of memories suddenly had nothing to say. Or maybe we had too much to say. The afternoon passed quietly. Sometimes he slept. Sometimes he looked out the window. Sometimes he looked at me. Several times I wanted to ask the question that had followed me for 20 years. Why didn't you ever love me the way I needed? But the words never came. I kept waiting for him to explain, to apologize, to tell me why everything happened the way it did. But he never did. As evening approached, he looked tired. I stood up to leave. "I'll come back tomorrow," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he smiled, a sad, gentle smile. I'd like that. The next morning, my phone rang before sunrise. I knew the news before I answered. My brother was crying. And just like that, the chance I had waited 20 years for was gone forever. The funeral was small and quiet. Family members came, shared memories, and left flowers beside my father's photo. I stood there and listened. Some people described him as kind. Others called him dependable. One neighbor said, "Your father helped me many times." I nodded politely, but part of me felt distant. I realized something painful. Everyone seemed to know a version of my father that I had never known. After the funeral, my brother and I returned to our old house. The rooms looked smaller than I remembered. The wallpaper had faded. The furniture was older. Yet everything felt strangely familiar. For 2 days, we sorted through boxes, papers, and old clothes. Most of it was ordinary: bills, receipts, family photos. Then, on the 3rd day, I opened the desk in my father's bedroom. It was the same wooden desk he had used for years. The top drawer was locked. My brother found a small key in a cabinet. When I opened the drawer, I saw several notebooks tied together with a string. Under them was a yellow envelope. My name was written on the front. Just my name, nothing else. My heart suddenly began to race. "What's that?" my brother asked. I could barely answer. "I don't know." The envelope looked old, very old. The edges were worn. The paper had turned slightly brown with age. Slowly I opened it. Inside was a folded letter. The date at the top stopped me cold. It had been written 20 years ago, only 1 week after I left home. My hands started shaking. I sat down and began to read. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was my father's. The first line was simple. "My daughter, I don't know if you will ever read this." I felt my throat tighten. The letter continued. He wrote that he had never been good with words. He wrote that after my mother died, he felt lost. Every day he worried about paying bills, raising 2 children, and keeping our family together. He was afraid all the time, but he never told anyone. Then I reached a sentence that made my eyes fill with tears. "I know you think I love your brother more. That is my fault. I never learned how to show love properly." I stopped reading for a moment. My vision blurred. The room around me disappeared. Only the words remained. Then I saw the sentence that changed everything. "I'm sorry I made you feel unloved." I stared at those words, again and again. 20 years. For 20 years I had waited to hear them, and they had been sitting in this drawer the entire time. At the bottom of the envelope, I noticed something else, a stamp, an address. Everything was ready. The letter had been prepared for mailing. But somehow it was never sent. I pressed the paper against my chest, and for the first time since I was 16 years old, I began to cry like a child. I sat alone in my father's room long after my brother went downstairs. The letter rested in my hands. Outside the window, the sun was slowly setting. The room grew darker, but I could not stop reading. Again and again, I went back to the same lines. "I'm sorry I made you feel unloved." 20 years. 20 years of anger. 20 years of silence. 20 years of believing a story that was only partly true. For most of my life, I thought my father did not love me. Now I realized something different. He loved me. He simply did not know how to show it. As I continued reading, I noticed details I had missed before. My father wrote about the nights after my mother died. He said he often sat awake until morning, worrying about us. He wrote that every time I brought home good grades, he felt proud. He wrote that he kept my school certificates in a box because they made him smile. And then I remembered something. When we cleaned the house, I had seen that box. At the time, I barely looked inside. Now I knew what it contained. Pieces of my life. Pieces he had quietly saved. A fresh wave of tears rolled down my face. How many signs had I ignored? How many times had I mistaken silence for indifference? The truth was painful. My father had failed me in some ways. A child needs love that can be seen and heard. A child should not have to guess. But I had also failed to understand him. For 20 years, I never gave him a chance to explain. I never answered his messages. I never returned his calls. We were both trapped behind walls we did not know how to break. The room became completely dark. I finally folded the letter and placed it back into the envelope. Then I looked toward the empty chair near the window, the chair where my father used to sit. For a moment I imagined him there, older, quieter, still searching for the right words. A small smile appeared on my face through the tears. "It's okay, Dad," I whispered. The room remained silent. No answer came back. Only the soft sound of wind outside. But somehow I felt lighter. The anger I had carried for so many years was finally leaving me. Some apologies arrive quickly, some arrive years later, and some arrive when it is already too late. The latest "I'm sorry" I ever received came 20 years after it was written. The man who wrote it was gone. He never heard my reply. But if he could hear me now, this is what I would say. I forgive you. And for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I had finally come home.